Although the United Nations Charter contains no provision for a member state to secede, history shows that several countries have flirted with the idea, typically as expressions of discontent rather than concrete actions. One notable example is Indonesia in 1965, which temporarily withdrew from the UN, displeased with Malaysia's election to a non-permanent seat on the Security Council, a move it viewed as an extension of neocolonialism. Indonesia rejoined a year later following a change in government, with the UN choosing to regard the incident as a hiatus rather than a formal departure. More recent examples often reflect political rhetoric rather than serious intent. For instance, in 2016, President Duterte of the Philippines threatened to withdraw from the UN after facing criticism over his domestic policies. This was later dismissed by his foreign secretary as mere posturing, affirming the country's ongoing commitment to the UN. In the United States, proposals like the American Sovereignty Restoration Act of 2017, which advocated for ending U.S. membership in the UN, have occasionally surfaced in Congress. These bills, while mirroring some politicians' frustrations with the organization, rarely receive serious consideration and are often viewed as symbolic gestures rather than substantive legislative efforts. These examples illustrate a broader pattern where threats of withdrawal from international institutions like the UN are often used as tools of political negotiation rather than indicators of actual policy shifts. In recent years, countries from the BRICS alliance and the Global South have increasingly pushed for major reforms at the UN, arguing that it is overly dominated by Western nations, especially in the Security Council, where 5 permanent members, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, hold veto power. The BRICS countries have long advocated for reforming global governance structures, including the UN, to better reflect the interests of emerging and non-Western nations. Their push for reform stems from the belief that the current system does not adequately represent the geopolitical and economic realities of the 21st century, especially given their significant share of the world's population and economic output. As of now, Brazil, India, and South Africa, key BRICS members, do not have permanent seats on the Security Council. Additionally, the 54 African countries, which make up about 28% of the UN's membership, lack permanent representation on the Security Council, a long-standing point of contention. These nations seek greater influence in UN decision-making processes to reflect their significant demographic and regional importance. The absence of a permanent African voice on the Security Council underscores broader issues of representation and equity within the UN system. African nations, alongside others, argue that reforms are necessary to make the organization more reflective of current global dynamics. Moreover, these countries criticize the dominance of Western nations in major global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, which they say marginalizes developing economies. This perceived imbalance is seen as an obstacle to establishing a truly representative system of global governance. In recent years, nations like India and Brazil have advocated for expanding the Security Council to include permanent seats for major developing countries. However, this effort faces opposition from some Western powers. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, frequently challenge the existing international governance frameworks, arguing that these systems favor Western countries, particularly in decision-making bodies such as the United Nations and the IMF. They contend that the geopolitical and economic interests of Western nations are often prioritized over those of non-Western countries, especially in critical areas like human rights, international security, and global economic policies. A quick note: if you're enjoying our content, please hit the like button and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps us grow. Thank you. Members of the BRICS bloc, including influential countries like Russia and China, have expressed concerns that their domestic policies are often scrutinized more harshly than similar issues in Western nations. For instance, they argue that while Western countries frequently advocate for human rights abroad, they tend to overlook violations within their own borders or in allied nations. Furthermore, BRICS countries contend that the current global governance structure does not reflect the realities of a multipolar world where significant economic and political power exists outside traditional Western powers. In conflicts like the Israel-Palestine situation, responses from international bodies also appear inconsistent, with less intense condemnation for actions taken by Western countries compared to others. A glaring example of such disparity is the treatment of refugees in Europe. The differential responses to Ukrainian refugees versus those from Syria, Afghanistan, or Somalia highlight perceived inequities that may be influenced by race and religion. The European Union's reaction to the Ukrainian refugee crisis was notably swift and supportive, activating the Temporary Protection Directive for the first time, which granted Ukrainians immediate rights to live and work across the EU, access social services, and enroll children in school. This level of support was not extended to refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, or Somalia, who faced stricter border controls and less favorable asylum policies. This contrast is often attributed to factors such as geographical proximity, perceived cultural similarities, and political considerations. The immediate and widespread solidarity shown toward Ukrainians by both European citizens and governments was far more robust than the response to the 2015 refugee crisis, which primarily involved non-European refugees. Before we move on, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Do you believe refugees are treated equally in Western countries? Feel free to share any experiences or opinions you have on the matter. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have also been vocal about the need to reform major global financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. They argue that these institutions' governance structures are outdated, overly dominated by Western interests, and do not reflect the current global economic landscape, where emerging markets play a vital role. BRICS critiques the traditional leadership in these bodies, where Europeans and Americans often hold key positions, despite the significant economic contributions from emerging economies. To counter the imbalance of influence and increase their economic autonomy, the BRICS countries established the New Development Bank, NDB. This bank focuses on funding infrastructure and sustainable development projects in BRICS and other emerging nations, aiming to offer loans in local currencies to reduce dependency on the US dollar. Additionally, BRICS has been advocating for reforms to the IMF's quota system to increase the representation and voting power of emerging and developing countries, promoting a more balanced global financial governance system. These initiatives highlight BRICS' commitment to fostering a multipolar global economic order that better reflects the interests of diverse economies. However, tensions between BRICS nations and Western countries remain high, often driven by geopolitical rivalries. These tensions are evident in global economic and climate policies, where BRICS nations push for fairer treatment and support that considers their varying stages of development. Proposals to reform international institutions, such as expanding the UN Security Council to better reflect the modern world, are also part of BRICS' vision. They advocate for strengthening regional organizations to address local challenges more effectively. As BRICS expands to include more nations, its collective influence on the global stage grows. If reforms to existing institutions continue to stall, BRICS may look to establish alternative structures, potentially shifting global governance away from a Western-centric model. However, the success of these efforts will depend on the bloc's ability to navigate internal differences and conflicting priorities. Thank you for watching. We sincerely appreciate your time today. If you enjoyed this content or found it inspiring, please consider supporting us by liking the video and subscribing to stay connected with our community. Your support means the world to us. You can also watch another video from our channel, which is now on the screen. Thanks again!